Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series. And we are starting a new topic called Cloud Networking. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at infrastructure virtualization. A lot more big words. And here to help us with these big words is Mr. Ronnie Wong. How are you?
I am doing well, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining me on our Cloud Fundamentals series here. It is our time to jump into, of course, cloud networking. And this is probably a topic, even if you've been familiar with virtualization, the server virtualization concepts that we've talked about. If there's anything that people normally have a hard time in getting to understand a little bit at the beginning, even with virtualization technologies and using the hypervisor, is when we say, hey, we need to connect this to a different network, or we need this to actually end up working. So inside of the virtualization technology itself, it gives you so many different options that you can connect to. Well, that's a problem, right? We have to actually think about how that works a little bit and understand the infrastructure behind this, especially as we move into the cloud networking arena. Okay, so that's why I want to talk about the idea of infrastructure virtualization itself, which is talking about how in the world is that infrastructure virtualized when it comes down to networking. Okay, is what we want to do. Okay, now when we think about it, just in a regular production environment, right? The idea of getting connected together so that computers can talk to one another, of course, goes across the idea of a network. Okay. Now, in that sense, that means we normally have endpoints, right? Something that you and I might be at, or maybe a server that's out there, and then we have to be able to connect them together. Now, today, we tend to use what we call layer 2 switches, right? The data link layer switches that allow us to plug in, and then we can connect to another particular endpoint out there as well. Okay. Now, what we've just talked about, though, in server virtualization, though, Vaughn, this turns out a little bit differently. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. So let me zoom in a little bit more. We'll get to the stuff on the right-hand side in a moment. But let's just take a look at the model that I actually have here. I've simplified a little bit from what we talked about in server virtualization. But Vaughn, now that I've got this, where I have the hardware server, I have the hypervisor, I have my VMs, they're all ready to go, we need to be able to actually run networking to them. But Vaughn, they're on one machine, okay, which is this one, okay? So Vaughn, let's just take this theoretically, okay? If I do that, and I'm going to say that this particular physical computer I have only has one network adapter. So Vaughn, I have two VMs, and there's one network adapter, okay? So how do I get that to work together, okay, with two separate VMs and one network adapter? In networking, that's a little bit harder, because if we're not sure about how this ends up working, if I just think about it from the physical standpoint, that one network adapter has a single MAC address. Well, both of these can't have the same MAC address on the network, Vaughn. That would never end up working on the layer 2 switch. It sends it to both, but it wouldn't know exactly which one it went to, so we'd probably end up losing some of the information or to get duplicated. So something else has to happen. Well, the great thing is in server virtualization, Vaughn, it's handled all in the actual hypervisor itself and how this stuff is actually managed as far as making sure that those connections end up working, okay? So we don't really have to worry about much, but the way that we would normally do it, right, is that we would take our individual VM, if we made them into hardware, right, it'd have its own hardware, we'd plug into a network adapter, and then we'd plug that into the switch on VM1, okay? VM2, we'd take the same thing and we'd plug that into a network switch and do the same thing. But now that we have this, there's only one network adapter, and now that's actually where it becomes problematic. So the way that this ends up working out is a way that we can describe it. And what we have to keep in our minds here is that it does become analogous to the same way that we do regular networking components when it comes down to multiple virtual machines on the same physical host. Okay. So when we start taking a look at that particular instance in nature here, right, what we're talking about is the virtualization of what we call, of course, the NIC itself, and of course some type of switch that we have, okay? Now, this switch connects us directly into our local area network or into the data center, so DC data center network, okay? So we do have a switch that connects us in there. But what about my entire VM host where there's actually only one NIC, which is represented right here, okay, that I only have one particular NIC that's involved, the way that I logically diagram that out and that I can start networking VMs together in this is to realize that here's what's going to be virtualized. So even on a single hypervisor, okay, Vaughn, what it creates if I want to connect them together is it creates what VMware, they're the ones that coined this particular term vSwitch, okay, a virtualized switch. So even in the hypervisor, there's a virtualized switch that allows me to connect VM1 and VM2 into the same network with each other, okay? That vSwitch then is represented to the NIC as another machine, okay? So in between here and the link that you see, and I can't make it do it without, so here, they actually can be two separate links that go, and they're represented differently, and that's because of this right up here, okay? Now, notice that each VM, it does the same thing. It emulates what? This NIC right here. We call it a virtualized NIC. Each one of these machines is seen as being different. When it makes a connection, it's working exactly on layer 2 like we would normally do it, even though it really is just software handling it, okay? So when you start to get confused about the way that networking works on a single virtualized host, always just think back to the model of just a regular network, right? I need these two virtual machines to connect together. Well, what do, Vaughn? I just put them on the same virtual switch that's going to be created. Now, that virtual switch can be called many different names, okay, depending on the software that you're using for your hypervisor environment. But as long as they're actually identical, okay, when you set up the configuration for this VM and for this VM, Vaughn, that automatically links them together in that same network is what we want to be able to do, okay? So that's the challenge here, is that we now need, of course, then, inside of this, that ability to be able to control the NIC so that both of these machines can get out. It also allows us to be able to communicate with the VMs itself, okay, and also externally. So if the VMs can communicate, that's fine. And if I can get out of the network from on one VM to another, I need to be able to do all that stuff too. And then lastly, I need to be able to configure the host to make sure that all this can get together. So Vaughn, that presents some different challenges. In the real physical environment, it's simple. I just put a NIC on everything and say, hey, I can go ahead and do this and make sure all this connection gets in. But once we virtualize it, and now we have to live in the virtual world and connect into the physical world as well, well, that becomes where software actually does its challenge in what we need to do. So in the in the network infrastructure virtualization side of cloud networking that we're talking about, right? There's a couple of other elements here, and Vaughn, the next thing I'm going to show you is pretty much identical to this standard virtualized switch here. But I do want to actually show you just a couple of things as well, and then we'll get into a fairly complex one that will actually show us how this works, okay? So normally you're running this, and I just chose this as a hypervisor, right? So we're running VMware's, let's say, ESXi. The way that we configure that is not through the hypervisor management, but through something that we call something like the VMware vCenter, okay? That is the software portal management that we are actually able to do and allows us to be able to connect what we need to. And it doesn't actually take a look at the underlying infrastructure of all this stuff. It just says you can call these things different names, and I'll know exactly what you mean to be able to connect to that. Every VM, automatically when you create it, it gives itself what it calls a virtual NIC. And then when we plug it in, these can be to two separate vSwitches if we choose to that are virtualized, so it doesn't have to be that way, or they can be to the same one. If we only need them to connect to each other, okay, well, we simply just put them on the same vSwitch together, and we don't worry about it, okay? So then VM1 and VM2, they can connect back and forth to each other here. I represent it with the dotted lines because there's not really physical cables here, okay? That can be done. But Vaughn, the other thing that this allows us to do is we connect up to the vSwitch. The vSwitch itself, or another vSwitch, can be configured where it says it goes external. So in other words, this particular vSwitch is also connected out to the rest of my network. And when we do that, we connect through something that we call the VM NIC, okay? So this is the entire VM NIC that we connect to. Internally in every single VM host, we can have a single vSwitch, or we can have multiple vSwitches depending on what we need. So that's something else that we can take a look at, all right? So Vaughn, let me see if I can show what I'm talking about here just briefly. And I'll just bring up my particular environment to help us out. If you, and just in case, at least I think I'm going to bring up my environment to help us out here. Okay. So I'm running VMware Fusion, and you can see that up here at the upper left-hand corner, VMware Fusion. And if I select, I don't need system preferences, I need VMware Fusion preferences here. Oh, where did it go? There we go. Okay. Now, notice that I have this icon that says network, and it's right here that we're talking about. So, Vaughn, each one of these essentially represent, oh, look at that, VMnet, okay? And so this is essentially representing a vSwitch for all of us that we actually can have access to. Also, all of these up here are representing different types of vSwitches too, okay? These are all virtualized types of switches for us. This one up here allows me that connection. Says virtual machine shares the IP address of the MAC on the external switch. The MAC provides a network address translation for network traffic from the virtual machine. So this particular vSwitch connects me out and says, hey, you're going to actually have the same IP address as this guy, and you're also going to end up having NAT translations to work the same way it does. We can also do the auto detect. But down here, Vaughn, if I select private to my Mac, virtual machine is connected to the Mac using a private virtual network, which is the same as the vSwitch. The private network is not normally accessible from the physical machine on the Mac. So this one says, hey, what we're doing is we're isolating your VMs only to this one machine. And so if you actually create two different VMs and you attach it to private to my Mac, you can do the same thing. And then there's other network adapters that have also been added in here. And that allows me to add in, Vaughn, if I wanted to, I could create a single VM, add in two different NICs. One that would connect to the outside world, and one that would actually only connect into the inside world, essentially making my machine the go-between if I wanted to. Or I could actually create a single VM to two different other VMs that are actually on two different networks too. So all that's actually very possible to be able to do something like this, okay? So that's just an example of what we mean when we do so. Now, Vaughn, notice I don't have to plug in any particular cable to do so. All I have to do is go to one of these machines here. So here's the one that's running in the background. I go back to the preferences, and on this one looks like it says it's shared with my Mac. I can select another one here and change that if I wanted to. Then I'd have to click OK. But that's how you simply switch it. So there's no actually unplugging the actual switch or anything. You're actually just making a change there to be able to do something like this as well. All right. So that's the example that we're talking about when we start taking a look at the idea of VMs here. Okay. All right. Now, once you get that, okay, the key though is understanding the logic here. Okay, remember that that's the logic, is that even though it looks strange for you and I just kind of moving things around, but we're really making this type of connection, which is probably more normal for most of us that have been working in networking. All right, Vaughn, of course, that means that once we move into the cloud environment and everything is connected up for us, it means things can get more and more complicated as well. Okay, so when we start talking about something like this here, okay, now let me show you a diagram that's going to be a little bit more complicated here. Okay, so Vaughn, here's kind of a typical way that we're actually talking about the virtualization. Okay, so the infrastructure virtualization for networking, at least at the most basic level, right, is in, the virtualization of the NIC. Okay, things that actually connect to individual machines. And then, of course, to a vSwitch, which essentially is connecting us to a LAN or to a VLAN, if you want to call that, whatever you want to do. So here we have the same environment. But Vaughn, I've also added in this DVS, which is a distributed virtual switch as well. Okay, so notice that I have two different, one VM host on the left-hand side, VM host 2 over here on the right-hand side. And what I've also done, Vaughn, is actually made sure that I was able to do a couple of things. Okay, each VM inside of each virtual machine host, right, also has, well, their own vNICs attached. Now, what if I wanted to make sure, Vaughn, that VM2 over on VM host 1 could directly connect to VM1 over on VM host 2? Well, I could just use the standard configuration, allow VM2 to go out to the virtual NIC here, and then to head outside the network on the VM NIC over here, go up to the access switch up in the data center network, go ahead and figure itself out down here and layer 2 on the vSwitch, and then configure and come across here as well. Okay, so all that's very possible. But when we do that, notice that that's not super efficient. So if I need a direct connection between VM2 and VM1 over on the different virtual machine host here, I could add a second VNIC to each one of these, and then I could connect it to a distributed virtual switch. And this works between two ESXi hosts, is what it does. It actually allows this connection to work as if they're actually directly attached into the same network that we want, but it can also allow for individual VMs to directly connect just to the actual distributed virtual switch as well to make other connections that it needs to.
It's like a secret passageway.
It is. It's pretty much like that, but it's designed really trying to make more efficient use of direct connections between them as you do that. Yep.
Yeah, because to go up and out and around and back in and down, that's a lot more hops.
Yeah.
There's a lot more places where you have to go to, and this is just one, two,
Yep.
instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, it actually gives us that ability. So I want to point this out when it comes down to the exam, Vaughn. These terms, I wish I could say, oh, you don't have to worry about these terms. Don't get so hung up on them. But they do want you to understand on the virtualization of the infrastructure, right? That a VNIC and what it actually does for us. And where does a VNIC directly connect? It doesn't connect directly to an access switch. It connects into a V switch. And depending on the V switch itself, you have to choose how you're going to connect this to.
It's just like our the FI, the
Fabric interconnector.
fabric interconnector, and you can't go from the server directly here. You have to go through the middleman. So it's the same idea
Right.
here, is that the V switch is the middleman between the VNIC to the access switch.
Right. So there's a couple of different connections that we want to make sure that we point out to be able to do this. Okay. So Vaughn, let me give you a scenario here. Okay. So let's say that over on VM host 1, okay, I want to make sure that VM1 and VM2 can connect. Okay. If I do that, what elements are actually involved in that connection? Okay.
On just VM host 1,
Right.
that would just be the V switch
Mhm.
there. And so those you wouldn't need anything extra because they're
Yeah. Except for
together.
what? The VNICs.
the VNIC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I were to actually say I only needed this to connect together, but what elements are involved? And let's say that there's a diagram, something similar to this. Again, I can't tell you it's on the exam because I really can't tell you it's on the exam. Okay. Because I really don't know that this is actually on the exam. But overall, though, I can tell you by actually understanding this diagram that yes, if I wanted VM host or VM1 and VM2 on the same VM host, if they need to connect, they both would use their VNICs to connect to the V switch, and that would give them their direct connection to that. Okay. Now, Vaughn, let's take it a little bit differently. Okay. Without using the distributed virtual switch here in the middle. Okay. Without using the distributed virtual switch, what if I wanted to make a network connection? Okay. Between, let's say, VM host 2 over on VM host 1 over here. Okay. And to a physical host anywhere else. Let's say it's somewhere up here in the data center network. Okay. So VM2 over on VM host 1 to anywhere else in the data center network. Okay. Well, I need to make sure I understand the elements that are also involved here to make that happen. So Vaughn, if I leave VM2, I would go out what? My VNIC,
Mhm.
come across the
The
V
V
switch
switch.
here.
Mhm.
Then I would also have to come across
The VM
NIC.
NIC.
Yep.
Not
Before-
the VNIC, the VM NIC, and then you can go out.
Yeah, then you can go out and hit that host. Yep. So that's another one that we also have. Now, Vaughn, the tricky one here, okay, is this guy. Okay. VMK NIC. Okay. Yeah. Go figure. Of all that, you're like, what the heck is VMK NIC?
I didn't even actually notice it on the diagram.
know.
until you said something like, oh, it's been there the whole time.
Yeah, it
so
really has.
What is that, Ronnie?
Yeah, this is something that's actually very useful for us. Vaughn, let's say that I realized something, okay? I've went ahead and I've installed my ESXi hypervisor onto this machine so I can build VM1 and VM2, okay? But now I need to manage that particular VM host 1, okay? Well, what happens is once we've installed the hypervisor, the way that we connect back into VM host 1 is that we would go through this VMK NIC, which stands for virtualized, the VM NIC, or the virtual machine, excuse me, kernel NIC. okay? Kernel, okay? Kernel Nick. So if Vaughn is out here in the data center or beyond the data center, and she needed to connect into VM host 1 to be able to manage like the configuration or to add in a new VM or anything else, she doesn't connect into the virtual switch. She doesn't connect into the NIC itself here or the VM NIC itself. She doesn't connect directly to the vSwitch. She would come in off the access switch. She would connect into a VM NIC on VM host 1. Inside of that vSwitch, then she would be connecting through to the VMK NIC, and then she could manage her ESXi host is what she could actually be able to do. Okay, so Vaughn, that's actually how that one ends up working out for us too. Okay, so all of these elements, as confusing as this thing looks, if you're an IT Pro TV subscriber, you'll have access to this particular diagram for you. But you can actually use that and kind of think about that, right? Vaughn, on the Cisco exams, it's not so much that it's tricky, okay? This really isn't that tricky. I've shown you every single path along the way. So that means that if we're actually preparing for the exam as well, I've got to think about that. How do I get access to here from here? Well, if you know what elements are actually involved in each of these layers, you can actually be able to do so. That's the key.
You just have to memorize the hierarchy, the topology of how this works, and just keep your V's and C's and N's all in the same configuration. Yeah,
Yeah.
because VM NIC versus V
Yeah.
NIC versus VMK NIC,
Yeah.
it could easily get confusing.
It is very confusing. And the reason behind all that, right, is because the hypervisor that Cisco absolutely has said that they've worked 100% to develop their cloud networking and virtualization technology is VMware, who, of course, has come up with all this, okay, is what they've actually done. So they're the ones that actually have come up with all this. So don't forget that you can still get access the same way that we did. I talked about the distributed virtual switch first. But remember that if you need to make a direct connection between two different hosts, you can always also go through this distributed virtual switch to do so.
If you wanted to, maybe
Mhm.
another scenario of doing VM1 on the VM host 1
Mhm.
over to VM2 on VM host 2,
Mhm.
you would have to install a second vNIC on VM1 connected to the DVS and then go to a second vNIC
Yep.
on VM2. So it's the
Correct.
same idea of you have to have two vNICs to be
Yeah.
able to get to that.
Yeah, that's because you're
DVS.
connecting to two different
That's so
switches.
many letters.
Yeah. But yeah, the whole goal is not to make you confused by all the letters, but you've got to be at least familiar with the terminology if you're going to do this. Okay. So these are the specific ones that are again, going to be Cisco centric in that sense because they've worked so closely with VMware. They didn't change all the naming to what their particular virtualization of their networking is going to be about. Okay.
Yeah, it's like internal, and then external.
Yeah.
Inside, then
Yeah.
this level, and then out.
Yeah.
Just remember how it works.
Yeah, there's a lot. Okay, there's no doubt. But Vaughn, that will at least give us the basics of the actual idea here of just the networking infrastructure. Now, we only did this between one, at the beginning here, right? Talked about the overall design when you talk about, of course, connecting in a single host, right? So remember that that's as simple as it gets. But once you start adding in multiple hosts, okay, now you have this. And if you add in a third one, it goes the same way. You still have to actually do the same things here, but you do have to remember to keep these things separated out and do what needs to be done. Okay. So Vaughn, that's just an overall straight and simplified way that we can do something like this. But we need to actually take a look at the hardware element that's actually involved in this as well. So Vaughn, in the next episode that we're going to go into, we're not really talking about the idea of of super big hardware, but we're going to talk about the first virtual appliance that we are going to end up connecting to, which is a virtualized switch that works exactly like a real switch does. And that way we'll get familiar with that technology as well. So Vaughn, this is a great place for us to end this kind of little jaunt into the world of networking or networking infrastructure. Now remember, this is an introductory course, right? It's the fundamentals. So we're not getting into all the details and all the configurations and everything that we're doing here, but you have to at least know and understand the concepts as we move forward. Okay, so Vaughn, That's what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at some more.
All right, a nice jaunt through infrastructure virtualization. I love a sauntery jaunt.
Yes.
So thank you, Ronnie, and thank you for joining us. But we're going to sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Fawn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.